The CEO laughed at his $200 car. Until Le Mans drivers lined up to buy the engine, the car cost $200. That was the number on the handwritten tag wired to the steering column of a 1973 BMW 2002, sitting in the far corner of a Saturday swap meet at the Delwood Fairgrounds, between a table of chrome trim pieces and a man selling valve covers out of a milk crate. $200 for a car that had no front bumper, one functional door, a headliner that had long ago given up its structural ambitions, and an engine bay that, to anyone who looked without knowing what they were looking at, appeared to contain a collection of problems held together by the optimism of the previous owner. The man who stopped in front of it was named Reuben Holt. He was 33. He wore a canvas jacket with a tear at the left elbow that he had been meaning to repair for approximately a year, and he was holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand and the hand of a 5-year-old girl named Iris in the other. Iris was holding in her free hand a stuffed fox named Scout, who had been a birthday present 18 months ago, and who had not spent a single night since then in any location other than directly beside Iris, including 3 nights in a hospital waiting room. When Iris had a fever that turned out to be less serious than the first hour had suggested, and during which Scout had, in Iris's assessment, been essential. Reuben crouched in front of the BMW. He set down the coffee. He looked at the engine for a long time. The way a person looks at something when they are not looking at what is there, but at what could be, which is a different kind of seeing entirely, and one that requires a particular quality of attention that looks, to most observers, like stillness. Iris watched him look. Then she said, "Do you see something?" he said. "I think so," she said. "Is it good?" he said. "I think it's very good." He paid $200. The seller helped him push it to the truck. On the drive home, the BMW behind them on a borrowed trailer, Iris held Scout in her lap and asked, "What did you see in it, Dad?" He said, "It has something in it that nobody's built yet." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I've been looking for it for 3 years, and this is the first one where the dimensions are right." She considered this. Scout's ears were pointed. This was a quality of Scout's that Iris found reassuring, a readiness to it, she said. "Like when you know it's the right book before you read it," he said. "Exactly like that." She held Scout a little tighter and looked out the window at the county road going past. And she seemed, in the particular way of children who have learned that their father's enthusiasms are worth trusting, satisfied. Don't go anywhere. What he found in that engine bay will take your breath away. The fairgrounds that morning had been the kind of Saturday event that Reuben and Iris had developed into a reliable routine. Not every week, but often enough that Iris had begun to think of swap meets as a category of outing with their own pleasures, which included looking at old things, the possibility of a good lunch, and the specific pleasure of watching her father see something that nobody else had seen. She had a good eye for the moment when it happened. He would go very still. His coffee would stop going to his mouth. His head would tilt slightly, as though he was listening as much as looking. She had started keeping a list. Not in a notebook. She was 5, and notebooks were still slightly unwieldy, but in the way that children keep lists, which is in the part of the mind that is paying attention even when it appears to be doing something else. The list had 12 entries by the morning of the BMW. Each one was a moment when her father had stopped in front of something and seen what it could be. He had been right 11 out of 12 times. The one exception had been a carburetor that he had bought for $40 and which had turned out to have a crack in the body that was invisible until the light hit it from a specific angle. He had kept it anyway, on a shelf in the workshop, because he said it was a useful lesson about the difference between potential and structural failure. Iris had thought about this for several days afterward. She had asked Scout about it. Scout, she reported, thought it was also important to know the differences but that it didn't mean you stopped looking. The workshop at the back of the house on Millard Street was the room where Reuben Holt spent his evenings. It had been his father's workshop, then briefly empty, and was now, after 2 years of slow reorganization and the installation of an engine stand that Reuben had built himself from, welded steel square tube, a space that did exactly what workshops are supposed to do. It made things possible. The BMW went onto the stand within 48 hours of arriving. The body was irrelevant, a fact Reuben had established within the first hour of inspection. What was relevant? What he had seen from the front of the swap meat stall when the hood was propped and the morning light had fallen across the engine at the specific angle that showed him what was there. Was the engine, not what the engine was, what the engine's architecture permitted. The BMW M10, the engine family in the 2002, was, in engineering terms, one of the most developed four-cylinder platforms of its era. What it was not in this particular example was stock. Someone, at some point in the previous 50 years, had modified the block. The modification was not visible from the outside. It was visible from the inside. When you pulled the head and looked at the bore spacing, and it was visible in the casting marks on the block itself, which Reuben photographed under magnification, and spent 2 evenings cross-referencing against period documentation before he was certain. What he was looking at was a prototype casting, a block that had been produced as a development unit, not a production part, not a race part in the conventional sense, but a machinist's experiment in bore spacing that someone, decades ago, had shelved in favor of a different direction. The bore spacing in this block permitted a configuration that no production M10 had ever used, a configuration that Reuben had been working toward theoretically for 3 years. In sketches in the notebook he kept by the workbench, in dimensions he'd calculated across multiple engines without ever finding the physical starting point he needed. Here was the starting point. He called no one that first evening. He worked until midnight, measuring, recording, photographing. Iris was asleep. Scout was beside her. The house was quiet, in the particular way that houses are quiet when everyone in them is at rest except one person, whose mind is working at a pace that the body is doing its best to keep up with. At midnight, he put down the calipers and wrote one line in the notebook. This is the one. Reuben Holt's day job was at a precision components company in the Millard Industrial Corridor. Not his company, though he had worked there long enough that the distinction sometimes blurred in the way that people who do their work with genuine care sometimes blur that distinction. The company was called Hartwell Precision. It supplied machined components to, among others, the automotive, aerospace, and medical device sectors. Reuben had been a senior manufacturing engineer there for 6 years. The CEO of Hartwell Precision was a woman named Diana Call, 36 years old. She had been in the position for 16 months, brought in to accelerate Hartwell's growth into higher margin sectors. She was intelligent in the way that people who have succeeded quickly are often intelligent, good at pattern recognition, good at synthesis, quick to a conclusion. She was also, in Reuben's experience of working under her, someone whose certainty sometimes moved faster than her information. He had seen this in 3 meetings. He had not said so. He was not someone who said things in meetings that served primarily to demonstrate his own observation. The 4th time he saw it was in February, in the Hartwell parking lot on a Friday afternoon when he had driven to work in the BMW. Not because the BMW was in any sense a reasonable daily driver, but because he was in the middle of a particular phase of development and wanted the engine nearby during lunch to run a measurement he'd been thinking about all week. Diana Call had seen it from her office window. She had come down. She had looked at the car for a moment, at the missing bumper, the one functional door, the general impression of a vehicle that had given up on several of its original ambitions. And she had said, in front of 4 employees who were in the parking lot for various reasons. Something that she said lightly, in the tone of someone who has assessed a situation quickly and found it mildly amusing. She said, "Reuben, I didn't know Hartwell was paying you enough to afford a collector piece." She smiled. She said, "Or is that what $200 buys these days?" She said it with the ease of someone who expects to be laughed along with. 2 of the 4 employees did laugh, the polite kind. The other 2 found somewhere else to look. Reuben said, "It's what $200 bought me." Yes, he said it evenly. He looked at the car. Then he said, "The engine in it is going to change something. I'm not sure how to tell you that without sounding like a person who has lost, but I wanted to say it." Diana looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled again, the same smile, and said, "I hope so, Reuben." She went back inside. He ate his lunch in the parking lot, running the measurement he'd been thinking about all week. The measurement confirmed what he'd expected. He wrote the number in the notebook and circled it once. He had been wrong about one thing. He had told Iris on the drive home from the swap meet that the engine had something in it that nobody had built yet. What he had meant was that the engine was the starting point for something nobody had built yet. It took him 3 more months to understand what he was building. The configuration permitted by the prototype block, the bore spacing he'd found, the dimensions it allowed, made possible a combustion geometry that addressed a specific and well-documented limitation in high-output 4-cylinder engines at elevated RPM. The limitation was not unknown in performance engineering. It was, in fact, something that significant engineering resources at significant companies had been working on for years with partial successes and persistent compromises. What the M10 prototype block allowed was a solution that the standard architecture physically couldn't accommodate, not an incremental improvement. A different answer to the same question. Reuben worked at nights. After dinner, after the bedtime routine, 3 stories, the glass of water that was non-negotiable, the particular arrangement of Scout beside Iris that had to be just so, left ear facing up, which Iris had explained was so Scout could hear if anything happened during the night. A logic that Reuben had accepted without argument because it was both impeccable and non-harmful. He went to the workshop. He had help eventually. An engineer named Marcus Webb, who he had known since university, and who lived 40 minutes away, and who drove over on the first Saturday of each month and spent the day in the workshop with him. Not building. Marcus was not a machinist, but thinking. Marcus had a quality that Reuben valued above most professional qualities. He could find the flaw in an idea faster than the idea could settle into confidence. 3 months of Saturday mornings with Marcus Webb had collapsed what might have been 2 years of wrong directions into a single clear line of development. He also had, in a way he hadn't anticipated, Iris. Not as a technical collaborator, she was 5, and then 6, but as the person who asked the questions that cleared his head when it was too full. She had a habit, on the evenings when she came to sit in the workshop while he worked, of asking questions that were simple, their phrasing, and not simple in what they opened. She had asked once, "Why does the engine have to go fast?" And he had started to answer technically, and then stopped, and then said, "It doesn't have to go fast. It has to be efficient. Fast is what happens when you get efficiency right." She had written something in what was now, at age 6, an actual notebook, purple, with Scout's name on it in her own handwriting, uneven but decided. She wrote things in it the way he wrote things in his. Not comprehensively, but accurately. Things worth keeping. She had asked on another evening, "What's the difference between an engine and a heart?" He had looked up from the workbench. He had thought about it seriously, because she asked things seriously. He had said, "A heart doesn't know it's keeping anything alive. An engine does if you build it right." She had looked at Scout. She had said, "Scout knows he's keeping me okay." He had said, "That's exactly what I mean." The engine. He had started calling it the Holt configuration in the notebook. Not with any public intention, simply because naming things helped him think. Was producing dyno numbers in month 8 that he had not shown anyone outside the workshop. He had taken it to a facility 40 minutes away, a dyno shop run by a man named Gerald Cross, who had spent 20 years testing race engines, and who had the professional flatness of someone who has seen enough impressive numbers to have learned not to be quickly impressed. Gerald had been quickly impressed. He had run the engine 4 times. The first time he had come out of the control room and said, "Run it again." The second time he had said, "There's an error somewhere." The third time he had been quiet for a while. The fourth time he had said, "Reuben, where did you make this?" Reuben said, "In my garage." Gerald had looked at the dyno sheet. He had looked at the engine. He had said no. Reuben said, "Yes," Gerald said. "On what equipment?" Reuben described the equipment. Gerald listened. Then he said, "You did this on a Bridgeport and an engine stand." Reuben said, "And a lathe." Gerald said, "A lathe." Reuben said, "And a mill, and a lot of time." Gerald looked at the sheet again for a long time. Then he said, "I know 3 people I want to show this to. Can I call them?" Reuben said, "Not yet." Gerald looked at him. He said, "How long?" Reuben said, "A month. I want to run it another 100 hours first." Gerald said, "I'll book the time." The 3 people Gerald wanted to call were people he called when something was real, which was not often. He had made the call 8 times in 20 years. He had learned to trust the impulse precisely because he kept the bar high. He booked the time. He waited. The call that reached Diana Call came not from Reuben, not from Gerald, and not from Marcus Webb, who knew everything but said very little. It came from a man named Adrian Foss, who was the technical director of a British endurance racing program. A program that had twice sent cars to Le Mans, that had a development budget for the following season, and that had received, through a chain of contacts that ended with Gerald Cross, a dyno sheet and a technical summary that Adrian had read 4 times before picking up the phone. Adrian had called Gerald. Gerald had told him what he knew. Adrian had tracked the development location to Hartwell Precision. An error, since the engine had been built in a home workshop, but an understandable one given that Reuben worked there, and had called Hartwell's main line, asking for the engineer working on an M10-derived development program. The call had been transferred to Diana Call's assistant. The assistant had routed it to Diana. Diana had taken the call. In the call, Adrian Foss, who was not a man given to promotional language, whose communication style had been described by those who knew him as telegraphic, had said the following: "I have a dyno sheet showing an output-to-displacement figure. I haven't seen outside a works program. I understand it came from someone at your facility. I'm calling to determine if this is a company asset or a private development." Diana had said she would look into it and call back. She had gone to the engineering floor. She had asked 4 questions. She had learned, within 20 minutes, that Reuben Holt was not developing any engine at Hartwell, that no Hartwell resources had been applied to any such program, and that the $200 BMW in the parking lot that she had smiled at in February had not, as she had understood it, been a curiosity. She had gone to the window and looked at the parking lot. The BMW was not there that day. Most days it wasn't. He drove it occasionally, when he wanted the engine nearby. Most days he drove a different car, and the BMW was in the workshop. She had stood at the window for a while. She came to the house on a Thursday evening. Reuben knew she was coming. She had called his work extension, and he had said she was welcome to, and he had told Iris at dinner that someone from his job was stopping by, and that Iris might want to set up at the kitchen table rather than the workshop. Iris had said, "Is it about the engine?" He had said, "I think so." She had said, "Should I bring Scout?" He had said, "I think Scout should come." Diana arrived at 7. She was professionally dressed. Not overdressed, but dressed for a meeting, which the driveway of a house in Millard County was not. She looked at the workshop with its light on. She looked at the BMW sitting outside it, under a tarp now, protected from a week of rain. Reuben had offered coffee. Diana had accepted. They sat at the kitchen table. Iris sat at the far end with Scout and the purple notebook, doing what Iris always did when adults were talking about things she wasn't supposed to. Fully understand. Paying close attention. Diana said, Adrian Foss called us looking for you. Reuben said to Saad, I know. He called me directly 2 days ago. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Reuben, I owe you something before we talk about any of this. He looked at her. She said, in February. The parking lot. I was glib about something I hadn't looked at. She said it without softening it. She said, I saw a car that looked like a joke, and I made a joke. I hadn't asked what it was. I hadn't asked what you were working on. I assumed, she said. I was wrong about that. Not wrong because of what the engine turned out to be. Wrong because a person who'd been at this company for 6 years, who did the work the way you do, deserved better than that from the person running it. She said it looking at him. Specific. No deflection. I was wrong, she said. Not the mitigated version. Reuben was quiet for a moment. He said, all right, she said. What does Adrian Foss want? He said. He wants to license the configuration for their endurance program. 2-year development arrangement. Exclusive in the endurance category. Non-exclusive otherwise, Diana said. Are you going to do it? He said. I need to understand something first, he said. Is Hartwell going to claim any interest in this? She said, no. She said it immediately. She said, you built it on your own time, in your own facility, with your own equipment. Hartwell has no claim. She paused. She said, but I'd like to if there's a way that makes sense for you. He looked at her. She said, Hartwell has machining capacity that your workshop doesn't. If this goes where I think it might go, you're going to need manufacturing infrastructure before the end of next year. She said, I'm not asking for the IP. I'm asking if there's a manufacturing partnership that works. Reuben looked at the table. He looked at Iris, who was watching with the careful attention of someone who was going to have questions about this later. Scout was on the table beside her notebook, ears pointed, listening. He said, I'd need the terms to be clean. Production rights stay with me. Hartwell provides manufacturing capacity on a fee basis. She said, I can work with that, he said. And one thing that's not negotiable, she said. Yes, he said. In February, in the parking lot, there were 4 people present. I'd like an acknowledgement from you, in a setting that includes some of those people, that the $200 car produced something real. Not because I need it, because precision matters. Diana was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I can do that, he said. Then let's talk about the terms. Iris came to the workshop after Diana left, with Scout under her arm and the purple notebook against her chest. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the BMW under the tarp. Then she said, Did it go okay? Reuben said, I think so, she said. Is the engine going to race? He said. Part of it. A version of it. She thought about this, she said. Which part? He said. The part that makes it different from every other engine. She said. The part you saw at the swap meet? He said. Yes. She held Scout in the listening position, flat against her chest, ears up, chin resting on top. She said, Dad? He said, yes. She said, when the engine races, will people know you made it? He was quiet for a moment. He crouched to her height the way he sometimes did when they were having a real conversation. Not talking down, just evening the distance. He said, the right people will. She considered this with the serious expression she brought to things that mattered. Then she said, Scout says that's enough. He looked at Scout. Scout's ears were pointed. His left ear had the slight permanent tilt of something that has been held, for many years, in one particular way by someone who needed him. He said, Scout's right. He stood. He had paperwork to review, an email from Adrian Foss that needed and a set of measurements for the second configuration that he'd been holding in his head for 3 days, and which he wanted to commit to paper before they shifted. He went to the workbench. He picked up the notebook. He opened it to a clean page. Iris went to her stool, the wooden one in the corner of the workshop, the one that had been her stool since she was old enough to sit on it safely, and she settled Scout into her lap, and she opened her own purple notebook to a clean page. They worked. The workshop light was on. The BMW was outside under its tarp, rain starting again against the roof, and the engine that had cost $200 and had no front bumper and one functional door sat in the corner on its stand. Patient the way things are patient when they know what they are and are waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Reuben wrote. Iris wrote, or drew, which was the same thing at 6. The rain came down. The page filled up.